Last night, I finished this book, Breath by James Nestor. Has anybody read it? My father-in-law has. He recommended it to me. He might be the only one. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it was very, very fascinating. It's just about breathing. It's a fascinating book. It's a terrifying book because he tells you that everything you're doing is wrong. At least me. Maybe you breathe perfectly. I didn't know that there was such a thing as mouth posture. I've been working on my own standing posture, but there's mouth posture and how to carry your mouth in such a way that you breathe and it opens up the nasal cavities and all of this stuff. And you're not supposed to ever breathe through your mouth. I didn't know that. And they're like, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. I know some of you are like getting nervous now. You got to read the book. But over and over, page after page, he just did tons of different experiments as he's consulting with doctors on how to breathe. And the main point of the book is very simple. It's breathing is important. And it's like, yeah, I kind of knew that, right? Like, I mean, you breathe, like if you stop breathing, game over, right? Like breathing is really, really important, and there's ways to do it well, and there's ways to do it poorly. And so he has all these different exercises throughout the entire book of how to become a better breather, to inhale and exhale through your nose. I was always taught to exhale through your mouth. He says, no. Inhale and exhale. Mouth is just for eating. It's not for breathing. He lets you know that. But over and over, he just gives the essential reality of breathing. And even in the front flap of the book, he says this: no matter what you eat, how much you exercise, how skinny or young or strong you are, none of it matters if you're not breathing properly. And shows all these scientific studies of losing years off your life if you don't breathe accurately. And as I was reading it, I started getting a little obsessed with how I breathe. Like you start getting you start freaking out a bit. Like, okay, I'm gonna die young because I breathe through my mouth a little bit too often. And the scariest thing about breathing is like, it's hard to retrain yourself. Like I know many of you are like freaking out. Like you're like, oh, how do I breathe? But like I've been trying, it took me a while to read through the book. But I've been trying to retrain myself on how to breathe, and it's just not very easy. Like you don't just read a book and you're like, oh, now I breathe the right way. 5.5 second inhale, 5.5 second exhale, through the nose, never the mouth. Like that takes years to begin to retrain your brain and how to breathe properly. And yet, if we don't do this accurately, it jacks up our bodies in a way that we weren't supposed to live. And as I was prepping this week for John 15, this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. It's Jesus saying, I am the true vine, you are the branches. And in verse 5, he's going to say that apart from me, you can do nothing. James Nestor in his book says the most important thing is that you breathe correctly. Jesus today in his passage is going to say the most important thing about your life is that you abide in my love. James Nestor in his book says, if you get this wrong, breathing doesn't matter what else you do. Working out, eating healthy, sleeping well, doesn't matter. If you miss breathing, you miss it all. Jesus is going to say, if you miss abiding in my love, you miss it all. You miss joy, you miss love, you miss peace. This is what's most essential for you in life. So if you have a Bible, run over to John chapter 15. We're going to be there for a bit. I've preached John 15 several times, but it's always different when you're preaching through verse by verse through a book where you don't kind of impose your own view on it and then just kind of find something you like, but really doing our best to see what Jesus is after. And if you've been with us, we've been going through John 15. Jesus is hanging out with his disciples. It's the last night before he goes to the cross. So it is this this Thursday night going into a Friday morning, and he's spending time with his disciples. Judas has already left the room. He washed his disciples' feet. He said, Judas is going to betray me. Judas, one of the disciples, walks away. He's planning his betrayal moment at that time, and Jesus is sitting with his disciples. And so these next few weeks that we're going to be preaching through, these are Jesus' final words, and they are so, so crucial for us to understand. They are beautiful and so essential. And so let's jump in. John chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes. And he prunes every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I in you. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains on the vine, neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him produces much fruit, because you can do nothing without me. If anyone does not remain in me, he's thrown aside like a branch and he withers. They gather them, throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you want, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. I am the true vine. When Jesus says this language, he has this imagery of a vine, of a vineyard. To the disciples who knew their Bibles well, they knew that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, each time it referred to a vine or a vineyard, it was God speaking about his people, the Israelites. D.A. Carson points out, though, that in the Old Testament, each time that a vineyard or a vine is used, it's used in a negative way. God is actually saying, I plucked you out as a vine from Egypt, and I planted you in good soil, and yet you got wild. And so for Jesus to say, I am the true vine, what he's hinting at here, we're saying quite deliberately, is that the vine that was supposed to represent God, Israel, Genesis 12, God's call to Abraham to be a light to the nations, to be a blessing to the nations. That was Abraham's job. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel's job was to be a light to the nations, and they failed at doing that. And Jesus shows up and goes, I'm the true vine. I'm going to accomplish what Israel failed to do. I will be the light to the nations. I will be a blessing to the nations. He's the true vine. He says that his Father is the gardener. I love the slow-paced reality of Christianity. Jesus does not say, I am a race car, and my Father is a pit stop crew member. Jesus is a vine, and the Father is the gardener. Have you ever seen a gardener in a hurry? If so, they're not doing a good job. Like especially if you're pruning a rose bush. You can't do that quickly. There's an art to it. There's a slowness to it. The imagery of producing fruit is slow. You try to plant something, it doesn't take place overnight. Jesus is saying, I am the true vine, my Father is the gardener. And yet in this passage, what's challenging is that if you remain in my love, you will produce much fruit. And we're going to talk about what is this fruit in just a bit. But he says that those that don't produce fruit are cut off, and those that produce fruit are cut back so that they would produce more fruit. That's rough to hear. It'd be kind of nice to hear, okay, if you don't produce fruit, you're cut off. But if you produce fruit, if you're a faithful disciple of Jesus, he just kind of coddles you. He just snuggles you and says, good job. If you produce much fruit, he prunes you. He cuts you back so that you'd produce more fruit. See, here's the reality. Life is hard. Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, life's hard. It's filled with suffering. It's filled with difficulties. It's filled with challenges. You can't discern who's Christian and who's not Christian based on looking at their life and seeing if they're suffering a lot or suffering a little. Everyone suffers. Obviously, some suffer more than others, but it's not this clear distinction like Christians suffer this way, non-Christians suffer this way. Everyone suffers, but there is a separation here in what that suffering produces, in that cutting back, what it produces. When Jesus, the Father, the gardener, prunes us, when we go through difficulties, when we go through challenges, it results in more fruit. It's brutal, it hurts, it's difficult. Many of us are in that season right now where life is hard. But Jesus wants you to know that your suffering is not in vain. It is not some meaningless thing that is taking place apart from the Father's care. It is His tender touch, pruning your life, cutting things back so that you would be more fruitful. Verse 9, let's continue. As the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. I love that phrase. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in His love. I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants anymore because a servant doesn't know what his master's doing. I've called you friends because I have made known to you everything I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. It is good news right there. I appointed you to go and produce fruit, and that your fruit should remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, He will give you. This is what I command you, love one another. Okay, so Jesus very simply is saying, I love you, stay in my love. The way you stay in my love is by obeying my commands. And my command is that you love others. I love you, stay in my love, obey my commands to stay in my love, and my command is to love others. Love is central. And yet the order is very, very important. When he talks about remaining, some translations say abiding in Jesus' love. Another way of thinking about that is making your home in His love. His love is here. We sit in it. We rest in it. And as we do that, we overflow His love and begin to love other people. So what I want to do this morning, we're just keeping it those 17 verses. We've been kind of tackling a chapter at a time. This section I just wanted to kind of look at a little more shortly. Jesus is saying, to the degree that you remain in His love, you will produce fruit, because apart from Him, you can do nothing. To the degree you remain in His love, that degree you will produce much fruit. There's a clear connection to sitting in His love, producing fruit. And as you sit in His love, you remain in His love, you produce much fruit, because apart from Him, you can do nothing. So I want to talk about, what is this fruit? What does it look like for a Christian to live a life of fruitfulness? Because Jesus assumes this is a reality. This is not like some varsity Christians get this, some JV Christians get this. It's all Christians bear much fruit. So what happens in the life of a Christian who remains in Jesus' love? Look at verse 5 again. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him produces much fruit, because you can do nothing without me. So what happens if you remain in Jesus' love? You produce much fruit. You produce much fruit. Somehow we've complicated this. And it's easy for us to think that Christianity, it's really hard to tell whether or not someone's a Christian. Jesus seems to think it's really easy. Like, do they bear much fruit? Yes or no? If they bear much fruit, yeah, they're a Christian. If they don't, they're not a Christian. Like this is, Jesus says in Matthew 7, you will know them by their fruit. Like it shouldn't be this complicated thing. And I love when people start dating in our church, specifically when they start dating people outside of our church. And I always, they come to me like, hey, I started dating this guy, this gal. I'm like, cool, here's my first question always. And I know most of you hate it. I go, they love Jesus? It's very intentional. I don't ask, do they claim to be a Christian? I don't care what they claim to be. My question is, do they love Jesus? And within 1 second, I can know whether or not that's true. Because I'll get this, one of two responses. Well, yeah, yeah, well, kind of like they, yeah. It's like, okay, no. Or, yeah, they love Jesus. Like there's fruit. Like I just know. Like it's obvious when I spend time with them. I've gotten to know them. Like there's a love for Jesus. It shouldn't be confusing. Yeah, no, I think so. They said on their profile maybe that they knew about God and that sometimes they pray and okay, different worlds here. If you abide in Jesus' love, you produce much fruit. You produce much fruit. So what is this fruit? Yeah, you've got some sun on you. Do you mind? Yeah, the times have changed, so Christian is glowing. God bless that man. That's the seat you want to be in right there. Thank you, Jose. Hopefully is it working? Yeah. Hopefully it'll work. If not, you can lay down on the ground or something. So what is this fruit that's being talked about here? There's a tendency when we see a word like fruit to go to other passages in the Bible and try to define what that is. It's not working, eh? Yeah? Okay. It's just a little slow. Cool. Yeah, as the times change, the sun, shows up in different spots here. So what is much fruit? Should we just wait a second? Let's wait a second. Moment of silence. Is it working?
It's going.
There it is. Come on. There it is. Wow. Thank you. There we go. Okay. Bring your friends and sit them right there. They'll be like, what's going on? Okay. If you love me, if you remain in my love, you will produce much fruit. What is this fruit talked about in John 15? Usually when you're reading the Bible, you want to stay in the section as closely as you can to understand what's taking place. So a word like fruit is kind of confusing. Like fruit, or apples, oranges, what are we talking about, right? Jesus is talking about this thing that is produced in your life. And to get kind of an idea of what that might be, you look in the passage near it. What are these things that might be related to fruit that show us what fruit is in this passage? I think there's, commentators point out a few different things, but some of the main things are this. First is answered prayer. Look at verse 7. If you remain in me and my word remains in you, ask whatever you want and it will be done for you. Okay, so there's an element of fruitfulness is prayerfulness. Now, the Bible is very, very clear that God does not answer all of our prayers. That would be great in some ways and then terrifying in other ways. I actually experienced this week. There was a miscommunication. I was chatting with somebody this week, and they asked me to pray about something. And I was praying hard about this thing for this person. And I was praying, and I texted her. I said, hey, did it happen? She goes, no. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. That's awful. I'll keep praying. And she's like, no, we didn't want it to happen. And I was like, oh my goodness. I totally misunderstood. And I was just like, thank you, Jesus, that you're sovereign, right? Like here I am pleading with him, please, please, please. And he's got to be like, did you hear her? Like, we literally want the opposite of this to happen. So thank God is not like, well, he's praying hard, so here we go, right? So thank God he doesn't always answer every single prayer. Yet there should be some evidence of prayerfulness and answers to prayer. The fruit of a disciple, as we stay near to Jesus, we get to know his heart more. And as we sit with him, as we know him more, we know what he wants. Spouses know this about their own spouse, right? Like, it's fun when somebody comes to me and is like, hey, what would Sarah like with this? I can tell you. What? Because I know her. I'm not like, that's weird. I have no idea. It's like, I know my wife. I know what she wants. I know what she desires. In the same way, as we abide in Jesus' love, we know what he wants. And as we ask him for things in prayer, we should be seeing these things taking place. But that assumes we're praying to begin with, right? Like, at least an abiding Christian that's producing fruit is praying. Whether or not you're tracking your prayers answered, okay, cool. We should be prayerful disciples who are spending time with Jesus, who love him deeply, that prayer and dependence are essential to the Christian life. He says, apart from me, you can't do anything. That should fuel our prayer life like nothing else. He's like, nothing matters apart from me. You can't do anything. All the things you're accomplishing, which are great things in the world, apart from him, anything that's going to have lasting eternal fruit can only come from abiding in Jesus. It's answered prayer is one element of fruit. Another element of fruit is joy. Look at verse 11. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Full joy. I've shared it many times. I don't like the separation that many Christians make between joy and happiness. I don't think it's a biblical reality. I think joy and happiness could be synonyms depending on how you define them. Sometimes we pit happiness against joy and it gets a little funky. We're like, happiness is bad, joy is good. It's like, we want to be happy, we want to be joyful. It's ultimately in Jesus. This is what he wants to produce in us. It's a deep joy, it's a deep happiness in him. Again, this is a fruit. Like, hey, are you a Christian? One of the questions you can ask to test your heart, like, do I find deep joy in Jesus? Like, do I enjoy him? Do I find happiness in being with him? He came to bring you fullness of joy. That's what he's after. All of this in this passage, you could say the entire Bible, is that he would make you happy. He wants that for you. He's a good king. Now, what we do is we think all these other things in the world will make us happy. And they can for moments. They absolutely can. But it fades. And it's not fullness of joy. Jesus wants to make you joyful. How can we always be joyful? Well, it's because we have him. You can lose everything else. You can't lose him. That's why we can always have joy. We get him. So he is an element of our joy. Joy is an element of fruit. And now, joy is also on the list in Galatians 5 of fruit of the Spirit. When Paul talks about the fruit, and not the fruits, right? It's not plural fruits. It's actually the fruit of the Spirit. Meaning, Tim Keller says, non-Christians can have bits and pieces of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, or peace, or patience, or kindness, or goodness, or gentleness. The reality is when Jesus takes root in your life, he produces all of these things. It's one thing. It's a fruit of love and joy and peace and patience. And joy is one of them. So is love. Now, what's a little complicated about this is that joy and love, all these things that are fruit of the Spirit, that the Spirit produces in us as we abide in Jesus' love, most of them, if not all of them, are also commanded of us as Christians to pursue. So there's a both and reality. As I abide in his love, as I sit with him and enjoy his company, he produces these things in me of love and joy and peace and patience. And yet I'm also commanded to love my enemies. I'm also commanded to rejoice at all times. I'm also commanded to be patient with my brothers and sisters, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven me. So it's this both and where I sit with Jesus, I enjoy his love, and I produce this fruit of joy in my life, but I'm also commanded to pursue it. Another element of this fruit is obedience. Look at verse 10. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I don't want to talk too much about that. I talked about that quite a bit last week. Jesus over and over and over is going to say, if you love me, you do what I say. If you love me, you obey my commandments. Do you want to see a fruitfulness of life? Simply ask, am I following Jesus? Do I do the things he's asking me to do? Do I follow him? And then the other component of fruit is love. Verse 12, this is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. And then in 17, again, this is what I command you. Love one another. This fruit, this abiding in Jesus, the element of fruitfulness is his love. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. As I receive his love, I give his love. It's this constant cycle of receiving and giving of his love. If I am not a person of love, I have very little reason to believe that I'm connected to the author of love. And not just loving the people that are nice to us, loving everyone, including our enemies. This is what a fruitful disciple looks like. This is what a fruitful disciple is growing into. And if it isn't this, Jesus says, you're cut off. Because these dead branches end up taking nutrients from the branches that are producing fruit. And he's going to cut it back and prune so that it would produce more fruit. So if this is what fruitfulness looks like, I think the next question for us would be, how do we do this? Like, how do we remain in his love, right? Because I could get up here and be like, guys, let's remain in his love this week. You're like, Like, how, what does it mean? Like, do we have to be in this room? Like, is this love just these four walls? And I feel his love here. Like, how do we remain in his love? Because if we remain in his love, these things will take place. What does it look like to remain in Jesus' love? The most important thing for you and I to grasp out of this passage, in order for us to remain in his love, is to grasp that his love comes first. He loves us before we do things. This passage is not saying, hey, you're a branch on the floor. What you need to do is start loving God, and then you'll be connected to the root of love. Verse 3 says, you're already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. You are already loved. Stay at home in my love. Take comfort who Jesus is talking to in this last night when he tells these disciples, you're already clean. How are these dudes in this upper room? Are they going to crush it in the next 24 hours? They're going to fail miserably. Within hours, Jesus is telling his disciples right now in the upper room, you are clean. I love you. Stay in my love. Within hours, Peter, Jesus' top disciple, is going to be cursing, screaming, I don't know who Jesus is, 3 different times to save his own life. Jesus goes, you're clean because of the word I've spoken over you. All of the disciples are going to flee. They're all going to run from him to save their own skin. Jesus is going, stay in my love. Make your home here in my love. You will never be able to remain in his love if you second guess that he loves you. Like if you're constantly playing the game, he loves me not, with God, you can't stay in his love. Sarah and I, we go out every Thursday night for date night. And it was last week, we're sitting at the bar, and there was a couple that sat there. We were already halfway through our meal, and then this younger couple sits down next to us. And you could tell it was like first or second date vibes. Like they're just like, they are at, I don't even know how to explain it. Just full max, like impressing the mess out of each other. I mean, they look wonderful. You know, I'm in like a dirty t-shirt, and like, I'm like, these two like did not just get here. Like this, and just, you know, you overhear some conversation, and they're just like this soft giggles and all that kind of fun stuff. And Sarah turns to me, and we just like had listened for a second, and Sarah turns to me, she's like, I'm so glad we're married. And I was like, I am too. Like, the dating, God bless those of you who are dating. Dating's so hard. It's so awkward. It's so difficult. And yet there's an element of dating. Like you better put that best foot forward, right? Like you can't show up without showing off. Like you gotta look good. And it's a hard aspect of dating. Because in a sense, in dating, you're trying to get them to love you. Like we would never say that, right? But like really, like when Sarah and I started dating, it was like, please love me. Like, am I lovable? Like let me show you how lovable I am. Like let me convince you, right? And now that we're married, it's like, all right, we love each other. We're good. We can stop playing games. You know I'm not lovely at all, but you still have to love me. Like now we're stuck in this thing where we got to love each other well. And I think so many of us in our relationship with Jesus still act like we're dating him. We show up and we're like, please love me. Do you see me? Am I lovely? Do you think I'm lovable? Please, please, please. And Jesus goes, I love you. Relax. Rest in my love. I know everything about you. I know the worst things about you. I still want you. I still love you. You're mine. He says, I lay down my life for you. He died for us when we were his enemies. He wants us. He desires deep intimacy with us. We cannot ever exaggerate his love. We have to grasp that first if we're going to try to remain in his love. If every time I wake up and I spend time in prayer, if I'm going, oh, I hope he likes me today, I can't remain in his love. I have to understand that his love is perfect and it is always there. He's saying, hey, stay here. This is my love. Don't go chasing other lovers. It's here that you will be filled. And yet, there is a difference between union with Christ and communion with Christ. Many theologians have pointed this out, and this, when I read this a few years ago, it was one of the most helpful concepts for my brain to wrap around, because for some of us, you're like, okay, Brad, you're saying he loves me, he loves me, he loves me. I don't necessarily feel that. And this is where you're right. We don't always feel his love. So there is a reality of union with Christ and communion with Christ. Union with Christ is the theological concept laid out beautifully here in John 15. He says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Have you guys been to the vineyards? They've actually got like vines over in Porter Ranch at the vineyards. They're really cool. They have like little grapes on them too. Like we were there last night. We saw the movie Lyle Crocodile. Save $50. Don't. But afterwards, we're walking through in the vines, and I was telling the kids, hey, Daddy's preaching about Jesus being the vine and him being the branches. And I was just showing them, like, when do you ever get to see a vine in the valley? And so I was just showing them. But the connection is beautiful. Like, when does the vine and the branch start and stop? I mean, it's this most intimate connection. Jesus is saying, this is what we have together. Our union together is that he's the vine, you're the branch. There's nothing that can separate you from him, okay? Yet, our communion, our feeling, our relationship with him does change based on a lot of things we've read in John 15. To put it back into a marriage relationship, Sarah and I are always married. Our union, the day we got married, 2011, we became one. We became united. Husband and one wife. We're one. Do we always feel that way? No. We don't. There are good days and bad days of marriage. Does it change whether or not we're married? No. On my worst day and on my best day, I'm as married as I've ever been. And it's the same thing with Jesus. On your best day, your worst day, you're still as married to Jesus as you ever were. But our communion changes, our relationship changes. There's things that impact my relationship with Sarah. And the same way is true with God. There are things that when we aren't pursuing him, when we're not remaining in his love, when we're not obeying his commands, it's hard to feel his love. He connects his love to his commands. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. How do you experience a lot more of God's love? By obeying his commands. See, many of us, we think of God's commands as these like random rules he just throws out of the heavens. Like, don't do that, don't do that. Jesus' commands are not random. They are deeply relational. They're his way of saying, this is how you stay connected to me. So let me give you some clear examples. When you walk around in unforgiveness and bitterness, it's more difficult to experience the communion with God. Why? Because communion with God, Jesus has said, I love you and I've forgiven you of everything. Go and forgive others. When you and I are living in that space of being able to freely forgive others despite it hurting, when we forgive others, we're experiencing his forgiveness over us. And when we don't do that, we're turning our back on God, going, Jesus, you don't understand how hard this is. I can't forgive them. We're turning away from him. He's like, come back to me. Come back to me. We're going, no, you don't get it. I know better than you. Any sin, anything, sexual purity, same thing. When we're walking in sexual purity, marriage between a husband and a wife, sex between a husband and a wife alone, when we're doing that, we're trusting in Jesus. We're walking with him intimately. When we don't do that, we're turning our back on him and going, I know better than you. It's nearly impossible to experience communion with God when we are turning our backs on him and going, I know better than you do. I'm smarter than you. You don't get what I've been through. And yet Jesus, even in those moments, is going, come back to me. Come home. Remain in my love. But there's a difference between our union and communion. We will never be able to break this union if we have been filled with the Spirit of God. I know it says in here that the branch that does not produce fruit is cut off. Some Christians believe you can lose your salvation because of passages like that. There are some in the New Testament, in Hebrews, that kind of make it sound like you can be cut off from God. And yet, as we've been going through John, you see other passages where Jesus says in John 10, no one can snatch you from my hand. And so I tend to believe that we can't be cut off if we're truly disciples. If we're faking it and we're not producing fruit, yes, there is a cutting off. But if we've been filled with the Spirit, we're his branch. And he's pruning us and he's making us new. But he says, come home to me. Let me fill you up with my love. And the last thing I'll say is this. In order to grow in our communion with God, our union's not going to change, but our communion can, of our remaining in his love, we have to build rhythms throughout our days and our weeks and our months of sitting in his love. I don't know how to do this apart from very clear rhythms built into my life of forcing myself to remain in his love. One of those rhythms is the Word, the Bible, reading it. Verse 3, he says, you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. I need to hear that over and over and over and over. I need to sit in the Word daily so that I'd be able to commune with the God who loves me. Everything else in the world seems to tell me that God doesn't love me. But when I dive into the Scriptures, I experience again that he loves me, that he's for me. That's one of the ways we sit in his love. We pray. Not just talking at God, but we listen to him as well. We build these daily and weekly rhythms of sitting in his love. Sometimes when I'm talking to some of you, you're like, man, I don't feel connected to God. I feel so distant. I'm like, okay, tell me about your day. What's a normal day look like? Well, wake up, kids are screaming, late to work, boss is yelling at me, get home exhausted, eat some quick dinner, watch Netflix, do it again. Good luck experiencing his love like that. It's going to be really hard. Is it possible? Yes. But it's going to be very, very difficult to remain in his love when you don't even remember him. We have to build rhythms before. I know not everyone's a morning person, but for me personally, it's hard for me to remain in his love if that's not the first thing I do in the morning. It's not a command in Scripture that you must do it, but man, if you're not starting your day remembering that he loves you, it's difficult. One of the Psalms that I recite each morning is, satisfy me in the morning with your steadfast love. Satisfy me this morning with your love, Father, because if you don't satisfy me right now with your love, I'm going to go seek it somewhere else. So we build rhythms throughout our day, not just even in the mornings, but throughout the afternoon, in the evenings. Going for short little walks, taking 30 seconds at your desk, wherever you're working, going, Jesus, recenter me. Help me remember that I am a branch, that you are the vine, that you love me, that this is home right here, that I don't need to go running after other things. Would you help me? So we want to be building healthy rhythms around his love, but I want us just to sit for a moment. I'm going to pray for us. I want us just to ask him to fill us up more with his love. So if you close your eyes. Jesus, we thank you. Thank you for the cross. We thank you that your love for us, it doesn't change, that you always are loving us. You're pouring your love out on us. Yet you've given us the ability to walk away from that love and to walk back to that love. Force us to remain in your love. You allow us to wander off. And yet when we do, you are constantly calling, pleading for us to return to you, to make our home with you. What an invitation, Jesus. Saying, move in with me. You've been living alone for too long, or you've been living with too many others. Move in with me. Place of love, place of joy, place of peace. Jesus, would you show us right now the areas of our life that may be getting in the way of our communion with you? I bet for many of us, we know immediately what it is. Spirit, would you give us the strength to cut those things off if they're getting in the way of you? We know that you will eventually. Because of your love, you will cut them back. You will prune us all. Yet there's something beautiful about us being